Before my son's wedding, I caught my future daughter-in-law secretly cutting the seams of my suit, with scissors muttering, "I'm going to humiliate you in front of 300 guests, you old fool." On the wedding day, I appeared wearing a flawless contingency suit. When her own plan backfired and she tried to frame me, I had the hotel's security footage projected onto the big screen. She froze in shock, but what happened next laid the entire truth bare for everyone to see. Thank you so much for tuning in to Wise Revenge. Which country or city are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Please note, certain fictional details are added for narrative and educational purposes. Similarities to actual names or locations are entirely coincidental, yet the practical wisdom shared is meant to help you. I have spent 40 years building things meant to last. I know what it looks like when someone is trying to bring one down. That is the thought I held in my chest on the morning of June 14, 2025, standing in a hallway on the 14th floor of the Ritz-Carlton, Chicago, watching my son's bride-to-be destroy the most carefully chosen gift my wife had ever given me. Her name was Vivian Ashford. She was 32 years old, and she was holding a pair of small sewing scissors, the way a surgeon holds a scalpel, deliberately, without hesitation, with the particular calm of someone who has rehearsed the motion before attempting it in a room where it counts. She had the vest laid flat across the luggage bench at the foot of the bed, and she was working the blade along the interior seam of the left shoulder panel, opening the stitching in a line so precise that from the outside, from any distance, a guest might observe me during the ceremony. The damage would be completely invisible. Until I moved. Until I reached up to embrace my son at the altar, or turned to accept a handshake from a family friend, or simply lifted my arm the way a man does 100 times a day without thinking. And then the shoulder would give, the seam would separate. And the jacket that my wife Evelyn had spent 3 weeks selecting, had driven 40 minutes each way to have altered by a tailor she trusted, had pressed herself with a travel iron at 6 o'clock that morning before I was awake. That jacket would come apart in front of 300 people. In front of every business associate I had worked alongside for 4 decades. In front of Nathan's friends who already looked at me with the careful deference of young people navigating a man they did not yet fully understand. In front of the photographers whose job it was to document every significant moment of the day. I stood in the shadow of the open doorway, and I did not make a sound. I am 69 years old. I built the Whitmore Group from a 2-truck operation in a garage in Bridgeport into a firm that has put up 14 commercial properties across the greater Chicago area. I have fired men twice my size on job sites for falsifying inspection reports. I have sat across from attorneys in rooms designed to make ordinary people feel small and held my ground without raising my voice once. I know what it feels like when something dangerous is happening nearby, and your body wants you to react before your mind has finished thinking. That morning, I let my mind finish thinking. Vivian tilted her head slightly, examining her work, and then she said something that landed in my chest, like a steel beam dropped from scaffolding. He thinks today is still his day. She said, her voice low and satisfied, the way a person talks when they are certain no one is listening. Let's see how proud he looks in front of 300 people when that shoulder lets go. I looked to my left. My son Nathan was standing 6 feet down the hall, his back to the door, his arms crossed loosely over his chest. He was watching the elevator bank, with the distracted, slightly uncomfortable posture of a man who has been asked to wait outside and does not fully understand why. He was not looking into the room. He did not know, I realized in that moment, with a clarity that felt almost physical, exactly what Vivian was doing on the other side of that door. She had told him something. Go stand there, keep watch, I need a minute. And Nathan, who had been trusting this woman for 18 months, had done exactly what she asked, without requiring a reason. My son was not her partner in this. He was her tool. The distinction mattered to me then in a way I cannot fully explain. It still matters to me now. A man who helps someone harm you knowingly is one kind of problem. A man who is positioned to block your view while someone harms you without understanding that is what he is doing, that is a different kind of wound entirely. That is the wound that takes longer to close. I stepped back from the doorway. I set my back against the wall of the hallway, and I breathed once, slowly, the way I used to breathe in the cab of my truck, before walking into a meeting I knew was going to go badly. I could feel my pulse in my jaw. I could feel the specific pressure behind my sternum that I have come to recognize over 69 years of living as the physical location of grief. I thought about Evelyn pressing that jacket at 6 in the morning. I thought about the way she had held it out to me the night before and said, her voice quiet with the particular sincerity she reserves for moments she means completely, "You built this family, Graham. Today you get to stand at the front of it." I thought about Nathan standing 12 feet away from me right now, arms crossed, watching an elevator with no idea that the woman he was going to marry in 4 hours had just told a room that his father's humiliation was part of the day's plan. And I thought, if I walk through that door right now, Vivian will cry. Nathan will defend her. I will become the story of the father who lost his composure on his son's wedding day. The footage on someone's phone will not show what I saw. It will show me red-faced pointing at a 20-something woman in a bridal suite while my son steps between us. I have been doing construction long enough to know that you do not demo a compromised structure by hitting it with your fist. You document. You assess. You determine the full extent of the damage before you decide what to do about it. I pushed off the wall. I straightened my shirt collar, and I walked back toward the elevator bank with the measured pace of a man who has somewhere specific to be passing Nathan close enough that he glanced over. "Morning, Dad," he said, and his voice was easy, untroubled. The voice of a young man who believed that the biggest challenge today was remembering his vows. "Morning, son," I said. "Big day." He nodded and turned back to watch the elevator doors. I pressed the button for the lobby and stood with my hands in my pockets while I waited. And I thought, I have 1 hour before this ceremony begins. And I intend to use every minute of it to understand why that hallway broke something in me, that no job site accident, no failed contract, no courtroom loss had ever managed to touch you. Need to understand what I had spent 40 years building before Vivian Ashford ever walked into my son's life. I did not come from money. I want to be clear about that because people who see the Ritz-Carlton and the 300-person guest list sometimes assume I did. My father was a pipe fitter out of Bridgeport who worked double shifts 6 days a week and still came home with enough energy to throw a baseball with me in the alley behind our building on Sunday evenings. He taught me 2 things before I was 12 years old, that a man's hands are his most honest biography and that anything worth having is worth building yourself. I started the Whitmore Group with a used pickup truck, a set of tools I bought on credit, and a subcontracting license I had studied for while working 60-hour weeks for a general contractor who paid me $11 an hour and never once learned my last name. I was 26 years old. I had $412 in a checking account and a 1-bedroom apartment in Pilsen with a radiator that knocked so hard through the winter nights it sounded like someone was trying to get in through the walls. I had Evelyn. That is the part that mattered. Evelyn Marie Cassidy Whitmore after a June afternoon in 1983 when she walked down the aisle of St. Gabriel's Church in a dress her mother had sewn by hand and said yes to a man who owned more debt than furniture. She was 24 years old, and she had a laugh that could reorganize a room, and she had looked at me on our wedding night with an expression I have spent 42 years trying to deserve. She believed in the Whitmore Group before it had a name. She kept the books in a spiral notebook on the kitchen table while Nathan was asleep in the next room, cross-referencing receipts against invoices with a pencil she kept tucked behind her ear. She ran a household on a budget that would have defeated most people, and never once complained about it, not once, not in 42 years. Though there were months early on when I knew she was quietly moving money between accounts to make sure Nathan's school fees cleared before the electric bill did. Nathan James Whitmore was born in the spring of 1988, and the morning they put him in my arms in that hospital room, I understood for the first time in my life that I had been building toward something without knowing what it was. He was a serious child, curious, the kind of kid who took things apart to understand how they worked, and then more often than not, put them back together correctly on the first attempt. I taught him to read a blueprint when he was 9 years old, spreading the plans for a small commercial renovation across the tailgate of my truck on a Saturday morning, and walking him through every symbol and notation while he asked questions I sometimes had to think hard before answering. He retained everything. He always retained everything. Those were the years I think about most, when the rest of it becomes too heavy to carry without setting some of it down. I thought about them that morning in the elevator descending from the 14th floor, with my jaw still tight and my hands loose at my sides. I thought about the tailgate and the blueprints, and the way Nathan used to pronounce the word elevation, with the emphasis on the wrong syllable until he was 11, and suddenly one day got it right without being corrected. I thought about Evelyn at the kitchen table with her pencil and her spiral notebook, and about the look on her face the afternoon I came home and told her we had landed our first major contract, a 4-story mixed-use development in the South Loop, and she had set down her coffee cup and covered her mouth with both hands and cried in the way people cry when something they have been holding their breath for finally arrives. I thought about the vest Evelyn had chosen for me. She had spent weeks tracking it down, making sure every measurement accounted for the slight drop in my left shoulder from an old scaffolding injury. She had handed it to me the night before with that quiet, unwavering pride she has carried through 42 years of marriage, telling me it was time for me to stand proudly at the front of our family. I had kissed her forehead. I had told her it was perfect. I had meant both things. In the elevator descending toward the lobby, I pressed the heel of my palm hard against the metal rail along the back wall, and held it there until the pressure in my chest did something slightly less than what it had been doing a moment before. Evelyn had ironed that jacket for me at 6 in the morning. She had been awake at 6 in the morning, ironing a jacket, thinking about her husband standing at the front of his family. And Vivian Ashford had been planning for God only knew how long to make sure that jacket fell apart the moment I moved in it. The elevator doors opened on the lobby. A young couple in formal wear stepped aside to let me pass. I nodded at them. I squared my shoulders. I walked toward the front desk with the particular posture of a man who has decided exactly what he is going to do next and has no intention of being talked out of it. 40 years, I thought. 40 years of permits and inspections and weather delays and contractors who cut corners and clients who changed their minds and site managers who swore a wall was load-bearing right up until it demonstrably was not. I knew how to handle a structure that had been compromised on purpose. I had done it before. I would do it again. And this time I intended to make sure that when it came down on the people who had weakened it and nobody else. Vivian Ashford walked into my son's life, the way certain structural problems walk into a building quietly through a place nobody thought to inspect at a moment, when everyone's attention was directed somewhere else entirely. Nathan brought her to Sunday dinner. For the first time in November of 2023, 18 months before the wedding. He had told us almost nothing about her in advance, which was not unusual for him. Nathan had always been private about the people he cared about, as though speaking of them too soon might somehow use up whatever was still fragile and new. He called me the Thursday before and said simply, "I'm bringing someone on Sunday, Dad. I think you'll like her." He said it with the careful neutrality of a man who very much hopes something will be true and is not yet certain that it is. I had the pot roast going by noon. Evelyn had made her apple cake, the one with the brown sugar crust that Nathan had been requesting for birthday dinners since he was 7 years old. We set the table for 4 and waited. Vivian Ashford arrived in a cream-colored coat and a smile so precisely calibrated that I registered it the same way I register a wall that has been freshly painted. It looks exactly right, which is sometimes the thing that should make you look more carefully at what is underneath. She was 31 years old, dark-haired, with the kind of composure that reads at first glance as warmth. She hugged Evelyn before she was invited to, which Evelyn loved and I noted. She admired the house in specific terms, not "what a beautiful home," the way people say when they mean nothing by it, but "I love the way the light comes through those windows in the afternoon. It must change the whole feel of the room," which was the right thing to say, and she knew it was the right thing to say, and she said it without a visible moment of calculation. That was what I noticed. Not the words. The absence of the pause that precedes them in a person who is still deciding what impression they want to make. Vivian Ashford had already decided. She had decided before she walked through my front door. Dinner went smoothly. She asked Nathan questions that made him talk about himself in ways that were flattering without being obvious. And Nathan, who was not a man, who talked about himself easily, talked freely, and with the loosened jaw ease of someone who has been made to feel genuinely seen. I watched Evelyn fall for her over the soup course. I watched it happen in real time, the way Evelyn's shoulders dropped from their cautious wait-and-see position into something more open, more welcoming, and I thought, good. I want this to be good. I want to be wrong about the pause I didn't see. I was not wrong. It was after the main course, while Evelyn was in the kitchen cutting the apple cake, that Vivian turned to me with an expression of thoughtful curiosity and asked the question that I have turned over in my mind on many occasions since. "Graham," she said, her voice carrying the slightly formal warmth of someone who has rehearsed exactly how much deference to perform. "Nathan tells me you've been gradually stepping back from the business. After you're fully retired, will Nathan be taking over the decision-making on everything, the properties, the contracts, all of it?" I set my fork down. It was a reasonable question. People ask reasonable questions all the time. The content was not the issue. The issue was the timing. Evelyn had just left the room, and the specificity, and the way Vivian's eyes, which had been warm and engaged all evening, sharpened by a fraction of a degree as she waited for my answer. The way a contractor's eyes sharpen when the number they actually care about finally appears on the page. "Nathan and I are still working through the transition," I said, keeping my voice easy. "It'll be gradual." "Why do you ask?" She smiled. "I just want to understand what Nathan's future looks like. I care about his stability." "Of course," I said, and I smiled back. Evelyn came in from the kitchen with the apple cake on a white ceramic stand, and Vivian's attention swiveled back to warmth and delight. And the moment passed the way moments do when you are the only one who noticed them. That night, after Nathan and Vivian had gone and the dishes were done, I sat on the edge of the bed and told Evelyn what I had registered during dinner. I said it carefully, trying to be fair, that there was nothing I could point to, specifically, nothing that would hold up as evidence of anything, just a feeling, the way you get a feeling in a half-finished structure when something in the load distribution is not quite right. Evelyn listened. She folded down her side of the comforter and sat with her hands in her lap for a moment before she answered. "Graham," she said, "Nathan is 35 years old. He doesn't bring people home. He has never once in his adult life brought a woman to Sunday dinner." She reached over and put her hand on my arm, and her grip was firm the way it gets when she wants me to really hear her. Don't look for problems that aren't there. Let him have this. I'm not looking for problems, I said. You're an inspector, she said not unkindly. You have been to your whole career. You walk into rooms and you look for what's wrong. That doesn't mean something always is. She was right, and I knew she was right, and I lay in the dark for a long time after she fell asleep, telling myself that the pause I hadn't seen could simply mean Vivian was confident. That confidence was not a character flaw. That a woman who knew what she wanted was not the same as a woman who wanted the wrong things. But I had spent 40 years learning to read the difference between a foundation and a facade, and something in the way Vivian Ashford had watched my face while she waited for my answer about the business. That particular sharpening behind the warmth settled into the back of my mind, the way a hairline crack settles into a wall, invisible from a distance, impossible to stop thinking about once you have seen it. I watched her more carefully after that. I watched her at Christmas, at Nathan's birthday dinner in February, at the long weekend in Lake Geneva that spring, where she wore a sundress and laughed at everything, and somehow, without appearing to try, managed to be standing next to me every single time the conversation turned to property values, or the Whitmore Group's portfolio, or what I intended to do with the Evanston building once the current lease ran out. Each time I told myself, you are looking for something that isn't there. Each time the crack in the back of my mind got a fraction wider. And then Nathan called in January of 2025 to tell us he was going to propose, and Evelyn cried with happiness into the phone, and I sat in my chair by the window and looked out at the backyard and thought, I hope I am wrong. I genuinely, completely hope I am wrong. I was not wrong. There is a specific kind of grief that belongs only to fathers. The grief of watching your child choose someone over you and understanding with absolute clarity that if you say one word about it, you will only push him further away. I had been living inside that grief for 6 months by the time the night before the wedding arrived. It had not happened all at once. That is never how it happens. It happened the way a foundation shifts incrementally, almost imperceptibly, one small degree of separation at a time, until the morning you walk into the structure and realize the walls no longer meet the way they used to. Nathan stopped calling on Sunday evenings sometime in February. Not completely, not forever, but the calls that had come reliably every week for years. The 20-minute check-ins where he would tell me about work and I would tell him about whatever project I was consulting on, and neither of us would say anything particularly important, and both of us would feel better for having talked. Those calls became every other week, and then once a month, and then occasional, and then the kind of thing that happened when he had a specific reason rather than simply because it was Sunday. I did not mention it to Evelyn. She would have called him, and then he would have known I had noticed, and that would have cost me more ground than the silence already had. In March, I suggested lunch. Nathan said he was busy but proposed the following Thursday. On Thursday, he texted to reschedule. The rescheduled lunch became dinner 2 weeks later, and dinner was pleasant and easy, and Vivian was there, which I had not expected. And the entire evening had the quality of a job site walkthrough, where someone has cleaned up specifically because they knew you were coming. In April, I told him carefully and without accusation that I had some concerns about the pace at which the business transition was moving. I had documents I wanted him to review. He said he would come by the house on Saturday. He did not come by on Saturday. When I called, he said Vivian had been unwell and he had stayed with her. I said I understood. In May, I tried once more. I told him directly that I felt the distance between us and that I wanted to understand if I had done something to cause it. Nathan's voice went careful in the way it does when he is choosing his words more deliberately than usual. Dad, he said, you haven't done anything wrong, But Vivian feels like you don't trust her. And honestly, I think she might be right. You look at her like you're waiting for her to make a mistake. I look at everyone like that, I said. It's how I was trained. She's not a job site, he said. She's going to be my wife. I did not push further. I said I would make more of an effort. I meant it when I said it, which is the part that still stings, that I meant it, and it changed nothing, because the problem was not my effort. The problem was that Vivian had already spent 18 months carefully, methodically repositioning herself between my son and every person who might otherwise have his ear. That is the thing about a well-placed wall. You do not always notice it is there until you try to walk through where you used to walk freely. The night before the wedding, I could not sleep. It was past midnight when I put on my shoes and walked the 14th floor hallway of the Ritz-Carlton, not going anywhere specific, just moving the way I have always moved when my mind is working faster than my body knows what to do with. The corridor was empty and quiet, lit with the particular amber warmth of high-end hotels, and my footsteps were absorbed by the carpet without an echo. I was passing the alcove near the ice machine when I heard Nathan's voice through the door of room 1412. I stopped. I am not a man who listens at doors. I want to be clear about that. I stopped because I heard his voice, and because something in the rhythm of it, low, urgent, slightly pressured, was a register I had not heard from my son in years. Not since he was 19 and had called me from a friend's car after a fender bender on the highway trying to hold himself together. I stood 2 feet from the door, and I heard Vivian say, her voice smooth and unhurried the way it always was. Just get through tomorrow. After that, everything gets easier. And I heard my son who had learned to read blueprints on the tailgate of my pickup truck, who had mispronounced elevation until he was 11 years old, who had cried exactly twice in his adult life in front of me, and both times had apologized for it. Immediately, I heard my son answer. After tomorrow, he won't be able to control any of it anymore. The carpet absorbed my footsteps on the way back to my room just as completely as it had on the way out. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without turning on the light. Evelyn was asleep, her breathing slow, and even one hand open on the pillow, the way it always is when she is deeply under. I looked at her hand in the darkness, and I thought about everything I had built, and everything I had failed to see coming, and everything that was going to happen in approximately 9 hours, whether I was ready for it or not. Then I turned on the lamp on my side of the bed, reached for the notepad the hotel left on the nightstand, and I started writing down exactly what I needed to do before that ceremony began. I had written 7 items on that hotel notepad before I put down the pen and turned off the light. By 5:45 the next morning I was dressed, and by 6:15 I was walking the 14th floor again, this time with a purpose that had nothing to do with sleeplessness. The hallway of the Ritz-Carlton at that hour had the particular stillness of a building that has not yet decided what kind of day it is going to be. Room service carts waited outside 2 doors near the elevator bank. Somewhere behind the wall to my left, a shower was running. My footsteps were quiet and deliberate, the same pace I use when I am doing a pre-construction walkthrough, unhurried, methodical, attentive to everything. I reached the alcove outside room 1419, which the hotel had designated as the bridal preparation suite, and I heard the sound before I saw anything. A small, repeated snipping, precise and rhythmic, the kind of sound that does not belong in a room where a woman is supposed to be having her hair done. The door was not fully latched. It had been pulled to but not clicked shut, the kind of oversight that happens when someone enters a room quickly and with their mind on something other than the mechanism of the door. I did not push it open. I positioned myself at the angle the gap allowed, and I looked through. Vivian was standing at the luggage bench with her back half turned to the door. She had changed out of her robe into a silk blouse and tailored pants, which told me she had been awake and deliberate for some time. The vest, my vest, Evelyn's vest, was laid flat across the bench in front of her, the lining folded back to expose the interior seam of the left shoulder panel. She was working a small pair of sewing scissors along that seam with the focused attention of someone who had done this before, or had at minimum rehearsed it carefully. The blade moved in short, controlled strokes, opening the stitching without disturbing the outer fabric. From any distance beyond arm's reach, the jacket would look perfect. The shoulder would hold under the static weight of being worn. It would give the moment real lateral pressure was applied, an embrace, a handshake, an arm raised to acknowledge a room. She paused, tilted her head, and examined the separation with the critical eye of a person evaluating their own work. "That's enough," she said to herself, or possibly to the room. Then she straightened up, rolled her shoulders back, and spoke in the tone of someone issuing a verdict they have been looking forward to delivering for a long time. The words she said next were the same words I had heard through the door gap an hour earlier. Hearing them a second time in this context, with the full weight of what I now understood behind them, was a different thing entirely. My jaw tightened until I could feel the pressure in the back of my molars. I pulled my gaze from the gap in the door and looked to my right down the hallway. Nathan was standing approximately 8 feet away, his back to the door arms folded across his chest, watching the far end of the corridor with the slightly rigid posture of a man performing casualness rather than feeling it. He was wearing his rehearsal dinner shirt, untucked, his hair not yet done. He looked young from that angle, younger than 35. He looked like the boy I had watched grow up, making sure nobody was watching before he checked whether I had noticed something he had done well. He did not know what was happening behind that door. I was certain of it the way I am certain of structural things, not from a single indicator, but from the aggregate of everything I could observe. The angle of his stance, the way his eyes tracked the hallway without once cutting back toward the room. The fact that Vivian had spoken to herself inside that suite without lowering her voice or checking the door because she knew Nathan could not hear her from where she had positioned him. She had not told him what she was doing. She had told him to stand there, and he had stood there because he trusted her, and she had used that trust the way you use a scaffold, something to stand on while you do the work, something that does not need to understand its own function in order to perform it. That was the moment the grief I had been carrying for 6 months shifted into something else entirely. Something colder and more useful. I stepped back from the door, setting my shoulders square the way I do at the start of a long day on a difficult site. I breathed out once slowly, and I took a precise inventory of what I had just witnessed and what it meant and what I needed to do about it in the next 53 minutes. Vivian wanted me to fall apart in front of 300 people at my own son's wedding. She had planned it, carefully executed it cleanly, and positioned my son as an unwitting accomplice without his knowledge or consent. She had made 3 mistakes. The first was choosing a target who spent 4 decades learning to read the difference between what something looked like and what it actually was. The second was doing it in a hotel with a functioning security camera system and a management staff I could speak to directly. The third, and this one she could not have anticipated, because it required knowing me in a way she had never troubled herself to do, was that I do not walk away from a compromised structure. I assess it, I document it, and then I fix it. I turned and walked toward the elevator with 53 minutes on the clock. I intended to use all of them. I did not build a 40-year career in construction by trusting what people told me. I built it by documenting what I could see with my own eyes in writing before anyone had the opportunity to tell me I had seen it wrong. The lobby of the Ritz-Carlton at 6:20 in the morning had the polished, expectant quiet of a room that has been prepared for a day that has not yet started making demands. A young woman at the front desk looked up as I crossed the marble floor, and I told her I needed to speak with the duty manager. Not a request, a statement. The kind of voice that communicates without aggression that the conversation is going to happen and the only variable is how quickly. The duty manager was a trim man in his early 40s named Peterson, with the particular composure of someone who has handled enough early morning situations in expensive hotels to be unsurprised by most of them. I told him, standing at the edge of the front desk, rather than sitting in the offered chair, that I was Graham Whitmore, that I was the primary account holder for the wedding event booked under that name, and that I had reason to believe a personal item of mine had been accessed and deliberately damaged in the bridal preparation suite within the last hour. The item in question, I said, is a jacket. It was stored in the suite. I have reason to believe the damage was intentional. I would like to review the hallway security footage for the 14th floor, specifically the corridor outside Suite 1419 for the period between 5:30 and 6:15 this morning. Peterson's expression remained professionally neutral. In the United States, hotel security footage captured in common areas, hallways, lobbies, elevator banks, is the property of the hotel and may be reviewed by management at their discretion. A guest requesting review of footage relating to their own property or personal safety is a standard situation that most hotel managers are trained to handle. Peterson understood this. He excused himself for 4 minutes, returned, and led me to a small office behind the concierge desk. The footage was clear, high-definition, well-lit, time-stamped, and positioned at an angle that covered the full length of the 14th floor corridor, including the doorway of Suite 1419. I watched Vivian enter the suite at 5:47 a.m. carrying a small zippered case I had not noticed her holding when I observed her through the door gap. I watched Nathan take up his position in the hallway at 5:52, arms folded back to the door. I watched the door remain pulled to but unlatched for the full duration. I watched myself appear at the far end of the corridor at 6:14 approach stop, and after approximately 90 seconds turn and walk back toward the elevator. I asked Peterson whether there were any additional records connected to the hallway footage, including entry logs, staff reports, or any documentation showing who accessed Suite 1419 that morning. He confirmed that the hotel could preserve all available records while their security team reviewed the situation. He confirmed that it had covering the entry area and luggage bench. I asked Peterson if I could have a copy of the relevant segment. He said he would need to verify the request with the hotel's general manager before releasing a copy to a third party. I told him I understood completely, and that in the meantime, I wanted to ensure the footage was flagged and preserved. He confirmed it would be. I thanked him, shook his hand, and walked back to the elevator. In the elevator, I took out my phone and opened the voice memo application. I recorded myself stating the date, the time, the name of the duty manager I had spoken with, the content of our conversation, and the specific timestamp range of the footage I had reviewed. 40 years of documentation had taught me that what you can prove is almost always more important than what you know. A verbal record made in real time with specifics carries weight that memory alone does not. I sent the voice memo to my own email address. Then I sent it to Oliver Hayes, my attorney and the closest friend I had kept for 30 years, with a single line of text flagging this for your awareness. Nothing further. Oliver would understand. I got off the elevator on 14 and walked back to my room. Evelyn was awake. She was sitting at the small desk by the window in her robe, a cup of coffee held in both hands, looking out at the Chicago skyline in the early morning light. She turned when she heard the door, and her eyes moved over my face with the practiced attention of a woman who has been reading the same face for 42 years. "You've been up for a while," she said. It was not a question. "Couldn't sleep," I said. "Went for a walk." She watched me cross to the closet. She watched me push aside the damaged vest still hanging where I had left it and take out the garment bag I had hung behind it the night before. Inside the bag was a second vest, Same cut, different cloth charcoal rather than navy that I had brought as a contingency, the way I bring backup materials to every job site. Because in 40 years, I have learned that the thing you do not prepare for is always the thing that happens. Graham, Evelyn said, setting down her coffee cup. Her voice had changed register slightly the way it does when she is about to ask something she already suspects the answer to. What is going on? I took the charcoal vest from the bag and laid it across the bed. I smoothed the shoulders with both hands, checking the seams the way I had checked 1,000 material deliveries over 4 decades, not because I doubted the quality, but because checking is what you do when something matters. Today might have a few surprises, I said, but nothing that isn't already handled. She stared at me for a long moment. Her jaw tightened. Then she stood up from the desk, walked to where I was standing, and put both hands flat on my chest, the way she does when she wants my full attention, without raising her voice. Whatever it is, she said quietly, you tell me everything tonight. All of it. Tonight, I said. I promise. She held my gaze for 3 more seconds. Then she nodded, once stepped back, and picked up her coffee. I began getting dressed for my son's wedding with 41 minutes left on the clock and a very clear understanding of exactly how I intended to use them. The 41 minutes I had remaining that morning were enough. I will not detail every action I took between 7 and 2 o'clock that afternoon, because some of it is not mine to put into words yet, and some of it was simply the ordinary business of a wedding day breakfast. I did not taste a collar. I straightened 3 times in the mirror without knowing I was doing it a phone call from the florist that Evelyn handled, while I sat on the edge of the bed and went through everything in my mind one more time, the way I go through a structural checklist before a pour. Methodical, sequential, nothing skipped. What I will tell you is that by the time I walked into the Ritz-Carlton ballroom at 1:45 that afternoon, everything that needed to be in place was in place. And I was ready. The ballroom held 300 people with the particular ease of a room designed to make 300 people feel like exactly the right number. Cream and ivory arrangements rose from every table in the kind of floral abundance that costs more per centerpiece than I had paid for my first truck. The late afternoon light came through the tall windows on the south wall and laid itself across the marble floor in long gold rectangles that the guests stepped through without noticing the way people move through beauty when they have been surrounded by it long enough to stop seeing it. I stood near the entrance and watched the room fill. I shook hands with men I had known for 30 years. I accepted embraces from Evelyn's sisters who had driven in from Milwaukee and Cincinnati, and who smelled collectively of the same floral perfume they had been wearing at every family occasion since 1987. I told Nathan's college roommate, a good-natured orthopedic surgeon from Indianapolis named Garrett, that he looked well because he did. I said everything that was required of me, and I said it correctly, and I did not let any of it reach the part of my mind that was still running the checklist. Evelyn was beside me for most of it, working the room the way she always has, genuinely, without strategy, remembering the names of people's children and the outcomes of medical procedures and the details of home renovations she had heard about at Christmas parties 3 years ago. She is better at people than I am. She always has been. I build the structures. She makes them feel like somewhere worth being. She squeezed my hand once briefly as we moved from one cluster of guests to another. I squeezed back. We did not need to say anything. I took my seat in the front row on the aisle, and I set my hands on my knees, and I waited. Vivian entered the ballroom from the far doors at 2:07 minutes behind schedule, which I noted without surprise. She moved down the side corridor toward the bridal staging area, with 2 bridesmaids flanking her and a third carrying the train of her dress off the floor. The dress was extraordinary ivory silk charmeuse, with a cathedral train hand-beaded at the bodice, The kind of garment that announces itself before the woman wearing it has fully entered the room. I watched her walk, and I watched the dress, and I noted with the practiced eye of a man who has spent 4 decades inspecting materials under pressure, the faint irregularity along the left side seam of the skirt, approximately 14 inches above the hem. It was barely visible in motion. It would not be visible at all to someone who was not specifically looking for a stress point in the fabric. But I had been told about it by the seamstress at the bridal atelier on Michigan Avenue, whom the wedding coordinator contacted after the bride's gown required emergency attention before the ceremony. After finding her number in the vendor file, the wedding coordinator had shared with all parties 3 weeks prior. The seamstress, a meticulous woman named Carol, who had been doing bridal alterations for 22 years, had told me when I described what I was looking for, that the gown had come back to her shop for an emergency restitch 4 days before the wedding, after a seam had partially separated during the final fitting. She had repaired it, but she had told Vivian that the repair was a patch, not a restoration, and that the fabric at that point had been stressed enough that she could not guarantee it would hold under extended movement. Vivian had told her it would be fine. Carol had asked her to sign a release acknowledging the alteration limitation. Vivian had signed it. I had asked Carol to send me a copy of that document. It arrived in my email at 9:40 that morning, and I had forwarded it to Oliver Hayes without comment. Now I watched Vivian take her position at the back of the ballroom bouquet in hand smile in place, and I thought about Carol's word extended movement. Walking the length of a ballroom aisle, standing on a raised platform, turning to face 300 people. She walked toward the altar like a woman who had already won. I watched the hem of that dress move across the marble floor, and I watched the almost imperceptible tension that gathered in the fabric at the left side seam each time she took a full stride. And I thought about what Carol had said, and I thought about extended movement, and I thought about 40 years of watching materials perform exactly as their stress points dictated they would, regardless of what anyone wanted them to do. Some things come apart on their own schedule. The only variable is whether you are paying attention when they do. The processional music swelled through the ballroom speakers, and 300 people rose to their feet in the single fluid motion that crowds make when they are all responding to the same cue, and I stood with them, and I straightened the lapels of my charcoal vest, and I watched my son's bride walk toward the altar. And I waited. The ceremony ran for 38 minutes before the dress began to fail. I know the exact duration, because I had been tracking time the way I track time on a job site when something is under load continuously, without making it obvious the numbers running in a quiet background register while the rest of my attention stayed on the room. The officiant, a silver-haired Episcopal priest named Holloway, who had a voice built for acoustics, had moved them through the opening words and the first reading, and was midway through the passage about the nature of commitment when I saw Vivian shift her weight. It was a small movement. She turned slightly toward Nathan to receive his hand for the vow exchange, and in the turning, her left hip rotated just far enough to put lateral stress on the side seam of the skirt. Exactly the kind of extended movement Carol had described. Exactly the stress point I had been watching for 38 minutes. The sound was soft. A faint structural whisper of fabric under tension, giving way the kind of sound that would not have registered to anyone who was not specifically listening for it. But I heard it from the front row, and I watched the left side of the skirt shift almost imperceptibly outward, the repaired seam separating along approximately 4 inches of its length, and the beaded trim at the hip beginning to pull away from its anchoring stitches. Vivian felt it. Her chin dropped a fraction of an inch, the involuntary response of a person whose body has registered something wrong before their mind has caught up, and her left hand tightened around her bouquet until her knuckles whitened. She did not stop moving. She completed the turn, took Nathan's hand, and held herself very still in the way a person holds themselves still when they are trying to determine how bad something is, without looking directly at it. It got worse. When she stepped forward to receive her vow card from the bridesmaid, the movement pulled the seam further. The separation ran upward, now climbing toward the hip in a slow, inexorable line, and the beaded panel that had been anchored there swung loose at its lower edge and caught the light in a way that had nothing to do with the designer's intentions. A woman in the third row, I could not see her face, only the way her elbow moved as she nudged the person beside her noticed. Then the woman beside her noticed. And then the particular quality of attention in the room began to change the way the quality of attention on a job site changes when enough people have seen the same thing and are waiting to understand what it means. Vivian's face in profile from where I sat had gone the color of the ivory silk that was failing her. Her jaw was rigid. Her eyes were fixed on Nathan's face with the concentrated intensity of a woman trying to hold herself together through sheer force of looking at something steady. Nathan's expression was open and earnest and completely unaware that anything was happening below his eye line because he was looking at her face the way a man looks at a woman he is about to marry. The whispers reached the middle rows. Holloway, to his considerable credit, continued without pause, his voice steady and measured. Though I saw his eyes flick briefly downward and then professionally back to the couple in a single motion that cost him nothing and revealed everything about how long he had been doing this work. Then Vivian did the thing I had not anticipated. She stepped back from Nathan a single step, abrupt, not choreographed, and in the stepping back, her heel caught the separated edge of the beaded panel, and the panel tore free along its full length with a sound that was not soft at all. It was the clean, decisive crack of a material that has been holding against more than it was built to hold, and has finally made its decision. 300 people heard it. The whispers became something louder. Not chaos, not yet, but the collective intake of breath that precedes it, the room reorganizing itself around a new and unexpected center of attention. Vivian stood on the altar platform with the detached beading hanging from her left hip. One hand pressed flat against the separation in the seam, her bouquet crushed against her chest, and her face, the face that had arranged itself so precisely into warmth and composure for every occasion I had watched her perform through, was doing something it clearly had no prepared expression for. She turned toward the room, and then she turned toward me. Her eyes found mine across the distance of the aisle with the accuracy of someone who has already decided who is responsible for everything that has gone wrong in their life, and only needed a moment to confirm the address. "You did this." Her voice was low, but the acoustics of that room were exceptional. Father Holloway heard it. The front 4 rows heard it. Nathan heard it. Evelyn, sitting to my left with her hands folded in her lap, heard it and turned to look at me with an expression I had not seen on her face since the night our water heater flooded the basement on Christmas Eve 1996, the expression of a woman who is holding herself composed, because falling apart would not help anything, and she knows it. He never accepted me. Vivian's voice climbed now, pushing past low and careful, into something that wanted the whole room. He has been trying to destroy this wedding from the beginning. Everyone can see that, can't they? Everyone here knows what he thinks of me. She was building something. I recognized the construction. I had watched her build versions of it in smaller rooms. For 18 months, the careful architecture of a grievance presented publicly designed to make the audience choose a side before they had heard the full story. She had chosen the wrong room to build it in. I stood up from my seat in the front row, and the movement was unhurried and deliberate, and I buttoned the single button on my charcoal vest, and I looked at my son's face, which was the face of a man standing in the middle of something he did not yet fully understand, and I thought, not yet. There is one more thing that needs to happen first. Before anyone decides anything, I said, and my voice carried to the back of the room without effort. I'd like everyone to see something before I reveal what was actually on that screen and how this truth came to light. Drop 100 in the comments so I know you're still standing with me. And a quick reminder: what follows includes creative elements crafted for dramatic and educational purposes. If this kind of story isn't for you, feel free to step away right here. I have given a great many speeches in my life. At groundbreakings where the ground was frozen and the investors were nervous and the words needed to carry more certainty than I always felt. At ribbon cuttings where the building behind me represented years of decisions made in rooms that smelled like coffee and sawdust and the particular anxiety of borrowed money. At retirement dinners for men I had worked beside for decades, men whose hands I knew better than their faces, because in this industry you spend more time looking at what a man builds than at the man himself. I have never once in 40 years of standing in front of rooms needed to raise my voice to be heard. I walked to the audio-visual panel installed along the side wall of the ballroom, the kind of setup that every venue of this caliber maintains for slideshows and video tributes and the various technological rituals of modern celebration, and I connected the flash drive I had prepared that morning to the HDMI input port. The wedding coordinator, a young woman named Britta, who had been managing this event with considerable competence for the past 6 hours, stepped toward me with an expression that was equal parts professional concern and genuine alarm. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly, "what are you?" "I need 30 seconds of your screen," I said. "And then you can have it back." She stepped aside. The presentation display that had been cycling through photographs of Nathan and Vivian, their first trip to Napa, a hiking trail in Colorado, a candlelit dinner somewhere European that I did not recognize, went dark for 2 seconds. Then it came back, and it was not a photograph. It was a hallway. The 14th floor of this hotel at 5:47 that morning, in high definition and full color, time-stamped, in the upper right corner, in the clean white numerals of a security system that had no reason to lie. Vivian entered frame from the left, carrying a small zippered case, moving with the purposeful stride of a woman who had somewhere specific to be and had calculated exactly how much time she had to get there. She reached the door of suite 1419, pushed it open with her shoulder, and went inside. The room was very quiet. At 5:52, Nathan appeared at the far end of the corridor, hands in his pockets, and walked to a position outside the suite door. He stood with his back to the door and crossed his arms loosely and looked at the elevator bank. His face in the camera's angle was relaxed and untroubled, the face of a man waiting outside a room because someone he trusted had asked him to wait. The room was quieter still. The footage continued showing Vivian entering suite 1419 with the small case in her hand, then later leaving the room and meeting Nathan in the hallway. The timestamps, entry records, and hallway footage showed the sequence of events clearly. But the most important evidence came from another source. The words she spoke later that morning, the messages recovered from her phone, and the witnesses who helped confirm what she had planned, covering the entry and the main seating area. Vivian stood at the luggage bench with the zippered case open beside her. She removed the small sewing scissors. She folded back the lining of the vest, and she began to work. I had asked Peterson, the duty manager, that morning, whether the interior suite camera had captured usable footage. He had confirmed that it had. I had requested that segment be included in the preserved record. He had included it. 300 people watched the timeline unfold on the screen. They saw Vivian enter the bridal suite carrying the case, they saw Nathan guarding the hallway outside, and they heard the words she had spoken earlier that morning through the hallway recording. The evidence did not show a misunderstanding. It showed a plan. on a 12-foot screen, and then they heard her voice clear and unhurried, and utterly certain of itself, captured by the suite's ambient audio system, say the words she had believed no one but the walls would ever hear. He thinks today is still his day. Let's see how proud he looks in front of 300 people when that shoulder lets go. The silence that followed was the kind of silence I have only heard once before in my professional life on a job site in 2009, when a section of temporary scaffolding gave way, and for 3 full seconds every man within sight simply stopped. Not from indecision, from the particular human response to witnessing something that cannot be taken back. I let the footage run, then I walked to the center of the room, and I picked up the microphone that Father Holloway had set carefully on the altar table when he stepped back, and I held it the way I hold a tool with purpose and without performance, and I looked out at 300 faces arranged in the particular stillness of people who have just understood that what they came to witness today is not going to be what they expected. I looked at Nathan first. His face had gone through several expressions in the last 90 seconds and had arrived at something that had no name. I knew for it the look of a man who is processing the distance between what he believed and what he is being shown in real time in front of everyone he has ever introduced this woman to. I looked at Vivian. She was standing on the altar platform with the separated beading still hanging from her hip. Both hands pressed flat against her skirt, and her face had abandoned every arrangement it had ever practiced and was simply nakedly the face of a person who has been caught. And then I looked at Evelyn. My wife was sitting in the front row with her hands pressed together in her lap and her eyes fixed on the screen, which had gone still on the final frame of the footage. Her chin was lifted. Her back was straight, and the tears that had gathered along her lower lashes did not fall. She held them there by the same quiet, unbreakable discipline that had held our family together through 30 years of hard seasons. And she looked at that screen for a long moment, and then she looked at me, and I held her gaze, and I said the only thing I had come here to say. I found this. I said, my voice steady and carrying and completely without heat, 1 hour before this ceremony began. My wife spent 3 weeks choosing that vest. She ironed it herself this morning. I want everyone in this room to understand exactly what was planned for today and for whom and why. The room did not erupt. It does not in my experience when something truly load-bearing gives way. It went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone present has just realized simultaneously that the structure they were standing inside was not what they believed it to be. And in that quiet, the first person to speak was Evelyn. She did not shout. She did not accuse. She simply turned in her seat to look at Vivian Ashford, and in a voice that was perfectly level and utterly devastating, she said, I ironed that vest myself. My son's face when the footage ended was the second hardest thing I watched that day. The first was Evelyn's. The second was Nathan's. Everything else, Vivian's performance, the room's reaction, the controlled implosion of an event that had cost more money than most people earn in a year, all of that I could observe with the detached steadiness of a man who had known it was coming. Nathan's face I could not detach from. I had been looking at that face for 35 years, and I knew every register it was capable of, and what it was doing in the 30 seconds after the footage ended was something I had never seen it do before. He was standing at the altar with his hands at his sides, and he was looking at the screen, which had gone still on the final frame. Vivian, at the luggage bench, scissors in hand, the interior of the vest folded back, and he was doing the particular arithmetic of a person who is recalculating an enormous sum and arriving over and over at a number that cannot be right, but keeps coming out the same. Then he turned and looked at Vivienne. She had moved off the altar platform, and was standing at its base, one hand gripping the floral arrangement on the nearest table hard enough that two white ranunculus dropped their petals onto the tablecloth below. Her face had reassembled itself from the naked exposure of a moment ago into something more structured, the careful architecture of injured innocence arranged quickly and not quite evenly, the way a wall gets patched in a hurry and looks almost right, until the light hits it from the wrong angle. "Nathan," she said, and her voice was the voice she used when she wanted him to feel that she was the one who needed steadying. Low, slightly fractured, engineered to pull. "You know me. You know I wouldn't. This is manufactured. He has been against us from the beginning, you know that. You have always known that." Nathan did not answer her immediately. That pause, 4 seconds, perhaps 5, was the most significant pause I had witnessed in 35 years of knowing my son. Nathan was not a man who hesitated. He made decisions quickly and committed to them fully and defended them stubbornly, which had been in the last 18 months both his greatest vulnerability and the quality Vivian had most precisely exploited. The fact that he was standing in front of her right now, saying nothing with his jaw working slightly, the way it does when he is holding something back that wants very much to come out, told me more than anything he might have said. "I was standing in that hallway," he said finally, and his voice had dropped to something quiet and careful that the front rows could hear and the middle rows were leaning toward. "She told me to wait outside. She said she needed to get something from the room." He stopped. He looked at the screen again briefly and then back at her. "I didn't know what she was doing in there." "Of course you didn't, because she told me to, Vivian." His voice came down on her name like a hand laid flat on a table. Not a shout. Something more final than a shout. "Stop." She stopped. Evelyn stood up from her seat in the front row. She moved without hurry the way she moves when she has decided something, and the deciding is already behind her. She walked to Nathan, and she put one hand on his arm, not to comfort him. Not yet, but to stand beside him the way she had stood beside me through 40 years of things that needed standing beside. And she looked at Vivian with the expression I have seen her reserve in 4 decades of marriage for the very few occasions when she has been pushed past the place where grace is still available. "I want you to leave," Evelyn said. "I want you to take whatever you came here with, and I want you to leave this room." Vivian's eyes cut to Nathan, searching for the foothold she had always found there. The particular softness that had been her most reliable tool for 18 months. Nathan looked at the floor. Then he looked up. Not at Vivian, but at the middle distance beyond her left shoulder. The look of a man who is making a decision that is going to cost him something he cannot yet calculate. "Go," he said. The word was barely above a whisper, and it reached every corner of that room. Vivian's grip on the floral arrangement released. More petals fell. She straightened her posture with the mechanical precision of someone operating on will alone, gathered the damaged train of her dress with both hands, and walked down the center aisle between 300 people who parted for her in the particular silence of a crowd that has witnessed something it does not yet have words for. She did not look back. Father Holloway, who had remained at the side of the altar throughout all of this with the composed stillness of a man who had shepherded congregations through enough human wreckage to know that sometimes the kindest thing is simply to stay present, came forward and rested a hand briefly on Nathan's shoulder without speaking. Nathan put his hand over Holloway's for a moment. Then Holloway stepped back. The room began the slow, uncertain process of returning to itself, the particular social metabolism of 300 people absorbing something that had no precedent in their collective experience and attempting to determine individually and collectively what the appropriate next response was. I set the microphone back on the altar table. I walked to my son. He was still standing where Vivian had left him, at the base of the altar steps. And when I reached him, I did what I had not done since he was 19 years old and had called me from the side of a highway. I put both arms around him and held on. He stood rigid for 2 seconds, the way men do when they have been holding themselves together in public for longer than is sustainable, and then something in him let go, and he pressed his forehead against my shoulder, and his breath came out in a long, broken exhale that had nothing performed about it. "I didn't know, Dad," he said into my shoulder. "I swear I didn't know what she was doing." "I know," I said. "I know you didn't." Behind us, the ballroom was beginning to find its voice again, but I kept my arms where they were, and I let my son stand in the wreckage of the day he had planned. And I did not tell him yet that this was not the end of what I had found. There would be time for the rest of it. There would be time for all of it. Tonight I had promised Evelyn everything. For now I gave my son what he needed, which was the same thing he had always needed from me, and which I had not been close enough to give him for 6 months. I stayed. A building does not fall the moment the crack appears. It falls when enough weight accumulates on the wrong side of it over a long enough period of time that the structure no longer has the capacity to compensate. I have seen it happen on job sites, and I have seen it happen in families, and the mechanics are not as different as people who build things for a living would like to believe. The 2 weeks after the wedding were the quiet kind of difficult. Not dramatic, not loud. The kind of difficult that settles into the corners of a house and stays there the way cold stays in a room that has been closed up for too long, regardless of how high you turn the heat. Evelyn and I drove back to the house the morning after the ceremony, in a car that held more silence than either of us knew what to do with. I had told her everything the night before, as I had promised, sitting at the small desk in our hotel room, while she sat on the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap and listened without interrupting, which is the way Evelyn listens when what she is hearing is serious enough to require her full attention. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she stood up, went to the bathroom, ran the faucet for a minute, and came back with her face composed and her eyes dry, and she said, "What are you going to do about the rest of it?" I told her I did not yet know the full shape of the rest of it, but I intended to find out. Nathan was not answering his phone with any consistency. I did not push. I had learned in 35 years of being his father that Nathan processes grief the way he processes most things internally, first completely, before he is willing to let anyone else into the room with it. Forcing the door only locks it harder. I sent him a text every 2 days, nothing that required a response. A photograph of the front porch which he had helped me repaint 3 summers ago. A question about whether he needed anything. A single line once that said only, "I'm here when you're ready." On the 11th day he called. The conversation lasted 4 minutes and consisted primarily of him telling me that he was fine, that he was working, and that he would come by the house on Sunday. I said good. He came on Sunday, and we sat on the back porch and drank coffee and talked about a project he was consulting on, and did not talk about Vivian at all, and that was exactly right for where he was, and I let it be exactly right. But I was not idle in those 2 weeks. The question that had been sitting at the back of my mind since the morning I watched Vivian work those scissors was the one I returned to every time the house was quiet enough to think. Why not? Why had she wanted to embarrass me? That part I understood well enough. Pride controlled the need to establish a hierarchy before the legal knot was tied. But why had she needed to do it so completely? Why had it been important enough to risk the entire plan for a woman who intends to marry well, does not jeopardize the marriage for the satisfaction of embarrassing her future father-in-law? Not unless the embarrassment itself serves a larger function. Not unless there is something at stake that makes controlling the narrative, controlling how the room perceives Graham Whitmore, on the day the Whitmore family structure legally changes hands, worth the risk. I called Oliver Hayes on a Tuesday morning from the kitchen table while Evelyn was in the garden. Oliver Hayes and I had known each other for 31 years. We had met on a job site in Wicker Park in 1994 when he was a junior associate at a firm representing a developer I was subcontracting for, and he had flagged a contract clause that would have cost me $60,000 if it had gone unnoticed, and I had bought him lunch, and we had been friends ever since. He had left the large firm 12 years ago to run his own practice corporate law contract, disputes the occasional estate matter from a four-room office in Lincoln Square, where he kept a coffee maker that produced what he called the worst decent cup in Chicago. I need you to look at something, I told him. Not as my attorney yet, as someone I trust. Those are usually the same thing with you, he said. This one might get complicated. They usually do with you too, he said. What do you need? I told him what I knew. I told him about the wedding, the footage, the vest, the dress, all of which he had already heard fragments of, because I had texted him that morning from the hotel. Then I told him what I did not yet know, but suspected, which was that Vivian Ashford had not planned that wedding day maneuver out of vanity or spite alone. That there was a financial architecture underneath the personal cruelty that I had not yet fully mapped. That my son had been signing things and moving money and standing in hallways while people he trusted did things he did not understand, and that the pattern of that, the positioning, the dependency, the careful erosion of his relationship with every person who might otherwise have been paying attention, was not the pattern of a woman who simply wanted to marry well. It was the pattern of a woman who needed to marry strategically. Oliver was quiet for a moment after I finished. I heard him set down his coffee cup. How much access do you have to Nathan's financial records? He asked. He's shown me statements voluntarily before. Nothing recent. Get me whatever he'll share willingly, Oliver said. I'm not going to touch anything he hasn't authorized. But if what you're describing holds up, Graham, this is not a divorce attorney situation. This is considerably more specific than that. He paused again. Then he said in the voice he uses when he is about to tell me something, I am not going to enjoy hearing, I'll start with public records. Vivian Ashford. Everything that's searchable. Give me 48 hours. I gave him 48 hours. He called back in 36. Graham, he said. And the way he said my name leveled deliberate, the voice of a man choosing his words, before he has finished deciding how much to say, told me that what came next was going to change the shape of everything I thought I understood about the last 18 months. You need to come in, he said. Bring whatever you have, and bring Nathan if he'll come. Vivian Ashford on paper was a woman with excellent taste and catastrophic finances. Oliver's office in Lincoln Square occupied the second floor of a narrow brick building on Western Avenue that had been a pharmacy in a previous life, and still had the original tile floor in the entry, black and white hexagonal, worn smooth in the center by decades of foot traffic. I had been coming to that office for 12 years. I knew the sound the third stair made, and I knew the particular smell of the coffee Oliver kept burning on a burner he had never once cleaned. And I knew when I pushed open the frosted glass door and saw him standing at the window with his back to me and his hands in his pockets, that what he had found was not small. Nathan was already there. He was sitting in one of the two client chairs across from Oliver's desk, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. And when I came in, he looked up at me with the expression of a man who has been sitting with difficult information for long enough that the shock has worn off, and what remains is something quieter and harder. How much of it do you already know? I asked him. Enough, he said. Not all of it. Oliver turned from the window. He had a legal pad in one hand and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, which meant he had been going through documents for hours before we arrived. He set the pad on the desk and pulled his glasses down and looked at both of us, the way he looks when he is about to present findings he wishes were different. "I'll start with what's public record," he said. "Vivian Ashford has 3 civil judgments filed against her in Cook County Court over the past 4 years. 2 are satisfied, meaning she eventually paid, but both took more than 18 months to resolve, and 1 went to wage garnishment before settlement. The 3rd was filed 8 months ago and is still active. The creditor is a private lending company. The amount is just under $40,000. He let that sit for a moment. On top of the active judgment, she carries balances on 6 credit accounts, totaling approximately $140,000. The utilization rate on 4 of those accounts is above 90%, which in credit terms means she has been living at the absolute ceiling of her available credit for an extended period. She is not someone who had a bad year financially. She is someone who has been structurally insolvent for at least 3 years and has been managing it carefully enough that it does not immediately show." I looked at Nathan. He was staring at the legal pad on Oliver's desk. "The money I transferred," he said. It was not a question. "Tell me about the transfers." Oliver said, his voice professionally, even the voice of a man gathering information rather than rendering judgment. Nathan exhaled. He sat back in his chair and rubbed both hands over his face, and then dropped them to his knees and looked at the ceiling for a moment before he looked at Oliver. 14 transfers over 11 months, he said. She told me they were investment deposits. She said she had a contact at a real estate development firm in the West Loop who was bringing in outside investors on a residential conversion project. She said the minimum buy-in was $30,000, but that she could get me in for less because of her relationship with the contact. She said the returns would be significant. He stopped. I transferred a total of $63,000. The room held that number for a moment. Into what account? Oliver asked. An LLC she set up. She said it was standard for investment vehicles to operate through a separate entity. I believed her because... He stopped again. His jaw worked. Because I looked it up and she was right. LLCs are standard for that kind of investment structure. It was the right answer to the question I asked. I just asked the wrong question. What was the right question? I asked. He looked at me. Whether the investment existed at all. Oliver set his pen down. The LLC is registered in Illinois. I pulled the filing. The registered agent is Vivian Ashford. There is no development project in the West Loop associated with that entity. There are no outside investors. There is no real estate contact. The LLC is a single-member entity with no assets on record and no operating history beyond the receipt of funds. The word for what he was describing is fraud. Wire fraud, specifically, because the transfers had been made electronically, a federal offense under Title 18 of the United States Code, which makes it illegal to use electronic communications to execute a scheme to defraud. Each individual transfer constitutes a separate count. 14 transfers meant 14 potential counts. The federal sentencing guidelines for wire fraud carry penalties of up to 20 years per count, though actual sentences depend significantly on the amount involved and the defendant's history. I did not say any of that out loud. Oliver knew it, and Nathan would learn it, and there would be time for all of it. What I said was, "Is there more?" Oliver reached into the folder on his desk and removed a photograph. He set it on the desk facing us and slid it forward. It was a restaurant I did not recognize. Upscale, low lighting, the kind of place where the menu does not have prices because the clientele does not require them. The photograph had a date stamp in the lower right corner, February 14, 2025. 4 months before the wedding. Vivian was sitting at a corner table in a dress I had not seen her wear before. She was leaning forward slightly, her arms on the table, and she was smiling the smile she used when she wanted someone to feel they had her complete attention. The man sitting across from her was not Nathan. He was somewhere in his late 30s, well-dressed with the particular ease of someone accustomed to rooms like that one. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking at Vivian with an expression that had nothing professional about it. Nathan looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. Then he picked it up, held it closer, and set it back down on the desk with a steadiness that cost him more than it looked like it did. "Who is he?" Nathan asked. "That," Oliver said, "is what I need another 48 hours to tell you. I have spent my career learning to identify what does not belong in a structure. A beam running the wrong direction. A load path that terminates where it should continue. A support that has been positioned to look functional while doing nothing of the kind. You develop over 40 years a specific intolerance for things that are present without purpose, because in construction, something that appears to serve a function and does not is not neutral. It is dangerous. It fails at the exact moment you need it most." The man in the photograph did not belong anywhere near my family. Oliver called at 7:43 in the morning, 47 hours after we had left his office. I was in the kitchen when my phone rang. Standing at the counter with a cup of coffee I had not yet touched, watching the backyard through the window the way I had been watching it most mornings since the wedding. Not because there was anything to see, but because looking at something steady helps when the thing you are thinking about is not. "His name is Damian Cross," Oliver said. 38 years old. He runs a private financial consult firm out of a registered address in Streeterville. Though I use the word firm loosely, it's a one-man operation. With a website that has not been updated since 2022 and a client list I cannot independently verify. He has a Series 65 license which qualifies him to act as an investment advisor, so he is operating within the technical boundaries of legality. The license itself, however, was reinstated 14 months ago after a 2-year suspension. I set my coffee cup down. "What was the suspension for?" I asked. "The Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, FINRA, the body that oversees licensed investment professionals in the United States, suspended his license in 2021 following a customer complaint that alleged unsuitable investment recommendations, resulting in significant client losses. The complaint was settled without admission of wrongdoing, which is standard in these cases and means exactly as little as it sounds like it means. He paid a fine, completed a compliance course, and had his license reinstated." Oliver paused. "He met Vivian Ashford approximately 3 months after his reinstatement. I stood at the kitchen counter and thought about the timing of that. A man whose professional reputation has been formally questioned, whose license to operate has been suspended and restored, who needs urgently a new avenue of access to investable assets and the kind of established wealth that does not come with the institutional scrutiny that banks and regulated funds apply as a matter of course. He meets a woman who is drowning in personal debt and desperate for a solution, who has identified a target, my son, my family, the Whitmore portfolio, and who possesses the particular skill set required to get close to that target in a way that a man with Damian Cross's regulatory history never could. They were not a romantic partnership. They were a professional arrangement that wore the appearance of one. How long have they been in contact?" I asked. 14 months by the time of the wedding," Oliver said. "Possibly longer, but 14 months is what I can document. They communicate primarily through a messaging application that encrypts and auto-deletes, which I cannot access legally and would not attempt to. What I can tell you is that Damian Cross has been present at 11 events, restaurants, and locations where Vivian Ashford was also present over a 14-month period on dates that do not correspond to any professional context I can identify. He let me sit with that. The LLC that Nathan transferred money into, I said. Yes, Oliver said. I had the same thought. The LLC was registered by Vivian, but the registered agent address is a suite in a shared office building in the Loop. That suite is also the registered address for two other entities, both single-member LLCs, both registered within the past 2 years, both showing no operating history in public records. I cannot prove yet that Damian Cross controls those entities, but the address is his. I walked to the kitchen table and sat down. The full shape of it was assembling itself in my mind, the way a building assembles itself from a set of plans. First, the outline, the rough dimensions, the positioning of the major elements, and then the details filling in until you can see not just what it is, but how it was designed to function. Vivian had identified Nathan as a point of access. She had spent 18 months engineering his trust and his dependency and his distance from every person who might have asked the questions she could not afford him to ask. The LLC, the transfers, the investment story, those were phase 1. The marriage would have been phase 2. A spouse has legal standing in Illinois that a girlfriend does not. A spouse can be named on accounts added to titles included in estate documents. A spouse, in the context of a family business transition, can be positioned at the table where decisions are made. And Damian Cross, with his reinstated license and his unverifiable client list and his suite of shell LLCs in the Loop, would have been waiting on the other side of that table. I thought about what Oliver had told me Damian said to Vivian recovered from a source he had declined to specify, but which I did not press him on. Once you have control, Nathan stops mattering. My son, who had stood in a hotel hallway because a woman he loved had asked him to wait, who had transferred $63,000 because he had trusted the answer to the question he thought to ask, who had sat across from me in Oliver's office 2 days ago and picked up a photograph of a man he had never seen and set it back down with a steadiness that had cost him more than it looked like. I pushed back from the table. I walked to the back door, opened it, and stood in the doorway for a moment, with the July air coming in and the sound of Evelyn moving around upstairs, and the particular quality of morning that exists in a house where things are still being sorted out, and nobody is pretending otherwise. Then I came back inside, picked up my phone, and called Nathan. He answered on the second ring. I need you to come to Oliver's office today, I said. Both of us do. There is something you need to see, and I need you to hear it from Oliver directly. And then I need to talk to you about what we do next. A pause. Short but real. How bad is it? He asked. I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, at the garden Evelyn had planted the spring before any of this began, at the particular steady green of a July morning that does not know or care what is happening inside the house it surrounds. Bad enough, I said, that I did not want to tell you over the phone. I have had difficult conversations on job sites, in boardrooms, across conference tables, from attorneys whose entire professional purpose was to make me feel that I was standing on ground that did not belong to me. None of them prepared me for sitting across from my son in Oliver's office on a Tuesday afternoon in July and watching him understand in real time that the woman he had loved for 18 months had never once loved him back. Oliver walked him through it methodically. The judgments, the credit accounts, the LLC, the transfers, the registered address in the Loop that connected to Damian Cross. He spoke in the level, unhurried tone of a man who has delivered difficult findings before and understands that clarity is a form of respect, that the worst thing you can do to a person receiving hard information is to soften it so much they have to ask you to repeat it. Nathan listened without interrupting. When Oliver finished, Nathan sat with his hands flat on his thighs and looked at the surface of the desk for a long moment. His jaw was tight. The tendon along the left side of his neck was standing out the way it does when he is holding something in that wants very badly to come out. Then he looked up at me. "See, I transferred $63,000, he said, into an account she controlled. That she used to." He stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. "I signed documents for that LLC without reading them the way I should have. She told me it was routine. I believed her." His voice cracked on the last two words. Not loudly, just enough that it cost him something visible to continue. "I trusted the wrong person," he said. "Didn't I?" It was not a question, but I answered it anyway. "You trusted the person she showed you," I said. "That is not the same thing as trusting the wrong person. She built something specifically designed to be trusted. That is on her, not on you." He looked at me for a long moment. Something shifted in his face, not relief exactly, but the particular expression of a person who has been carrying a weight they believed was entirely theirs, and has just been told credibly that it was placed on them without their knowledge or consent. Then his eyes went red at the rims, and he turned his face toward the window, and he breathed out through his nose slowly and deliberately, the way I had taught him to breathe when he was 11 years old, and had broken his wrist at a job site I had brought him to, and was trying very hard not to cry in front of the crew. "What do we do?" he asked, still looking at the window. "We don't confront her yet," I said. "If we go at her now, she and Cross have time to move assets, delete communications, and build a narrative before we have everything documented. We need what Oliver can get us legally, and we need anything you recorded or saved that she sent you regarding the transfers." Nathan turned back. "I have texts, emails. I kept everything." "Good," Oliver said, and wrote something on his legal pad. "That is very good, Nathan." "And then?" Nathan asked. I leaned forward. "And then we let them believe they are still winning," I said. "We let Vivian think the dust has settled. We give her and Cross enough room to keep doing what they are doing. And when we have everything we need, we choose the time and the place." Nathan looked at me the way he used to look at me across the tailgate of my pickup truck when he was 9 years old and had just understood something about a blueprint that had not made sense a moment before. "You already have something planned," he said. "I have the beginning of something," I said. "I need you in it for it to work." He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he reached across Oliver's desk and picked up the pen Oliver had set down, turned it once in his fingers, and set it back. "Tell me what you need," he said. "A good contractor does not break ground until every permit is in order. Every inspection is scheduled, and every material is confirmed on site. You do not pour a foundation on a timeline driven by impatience. You pour it when the conditions are right, and not one day before, because concrete cured too fast or too cold does not hold the way it needs to hold, and a foundation that looks solid from the outside can fail under load in ways that are not visible until it is too late to do anything about them. I was not going to move until I had everything I needed. Over the 4 weeks that followed, Nathan did something that cost him more than anything I had asked of him in 35 years of being his son. He called Vivian, not once, regularly. He told her that he had been doing a lot of thinking, that he was not sure the wedding day footage told the full story, that he wanted to understand her side of it before he made any permanent decisions. He said these things in the careful, slightly vulnerable tone of a man who wants to believe the best and is looking for a reason to do so, because that was the man Vivian had spent 18 months learning to read and respond to, and Nathan understood with a precision that I had not taught him and could not have exactly which version of himself she needed him to be. She responded the way a person responds when they believe a door they thought was closed has opened again. She called him back within the hour. She said she had been devastated by how everything had unfolded. She said Graham had manipulated the situation from the beginning. She said she still loved him and that what they had built together was real, and that the financial arrangements he had helped her with were legitimate investments that simply had not matured yet. She said all of this, and Nathan listened, and he kept her talking. Under Illinois law, private phone calls require all-party consent to record, so Oliver instructed Nathan to handle all communications strategically. Nathan kept their exchanges strictly over text messages, detailed emails, and saved voicemails that Vivian left on his phone, all of which are fully admissible under Illinois evidentiary rules. In those messages, Vivian repeatedly referenced the Shell LLC verified the past fund transfers and made incriminating statements, attempting to cover up Damian Cross's involvement. Oliver reviewed every time-stamped log building an ironclad file of wire fraud, intentional misrepresentation, and civil conspiracy. He saved every text message and email. He documented every instance in which Vivian referenced the LLC, the transfers, Damian Cross, or the Whitmore family assets. Oliver reviewed each recording and confirmed their admissibility before we included them in what he was now formally calling the evidentiary file. By the end of the third week, we had enough. Oliver sat across from us in his office on a Thursday morning and laid out what the file contained, the original footage from the Ritz-Carlton, the Cook County civil judgment records, the LLC filing documents, the transfer records. Nathan had provided 14 hours of recorded conversations and a declaration from Carol, the seamstress, regarding the dress alteration release that Vivian had signed 4 days before the wedding. Each element, Oliver explained, was independently verifiable. Together, they documented a pattern of conduct that supported claims of wire fraud, intentional misrepresentation, and conspiracy. So what we do not yet have, Oliver said, is Damian Cross in the same room as the evidence. That was the part I had been thinking about since July. I called Vivian on a Friday evening from the kitchen table while Evelyn sat across from me with her coffee and listened to my side of the conversation with the expression she wears when she is watching me do something she trusts, but would not have chosen herself. Vivian, I said, keeping my voice warm and slightly tired, the voice of an older man who has reconsidered. I have been thinking about how this situation has affected Nathan, and I think I owe you an apology for my part in how things escalated. Evelyn and I would like to host a small gathering next month, something to clear the air. We would very much like you to be there. A pause on her end, shorter than I expected. I would like that, Graham, she said. I really would. 20 minutes later, Oliver's contact sent him a transcript of a call Vivian made to Damian Cross. She had said, "He's extending an olive branch, some kind of family dinner. I think he's finally ready to let go." Damian had said, "Then we're almost there." I read the transcript at the kitchen table and allowed myself for the first time since June to sleep a full night. The Whitmore Group had built 14 commercial properties in the greater Chicago area over 40 years. I had never once invited someone onto a job site without knowing exactly what I intended to show them. The gathering was held on the last Saturday of August at a private event space in River North that Oliver had recommended neutral ground, he said, which was correct, and which also happened to have a projection system I had confirmed with the venue manager 3 days prior. Vivian arrived at 7 with Damian Cross beside her. I had not told her to bring anyone. She had decided that on her own, which told me everything I needed to know about what she believed this evening was going to accomplish. She introduced him as a business associate, which was true in the way that a load-bearing wall described only as a partition is true accurate about the material, silent about the function. Damien Cross in person was exactly what his photograph had suggested, well-dressed, composed with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years making people feel comfortable in rooms where they should not be comfortable. He shook my hand and looked me in the eye and smiled with the confidence of someone who believed they were the smartest person present. I smiled back and told him I was glad he could make it. Vivienne was wearing a dress the color of deep water. She moved through the room with the particular assurance of a woman who believes she is walking into the final act of a plan that has been executing correctly for 2 years. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and touched Nathan's arm when she passed him. And Nathan, who had been preparing for this evening with the same quiet, contained intensity he had brought to every step of the past 4 weeks, smiled at her with exactly the right amount of warmth and said exactly nothing that gave anything away. Evelyn stood beside me near the back of the room. She knew the full shape of the evening. She had known it since the night I finally told her everything sitting at our kitchen table while the July rain came down outside, and she had listened without interrupting, and then sat quietly for a moment and said, "Do what needs doing, Graham. I'll be there." She was there. I watched Vivienne lean toward Damien at one point during the dinner service and say something close to his ear, and Damien glanced once around the room and then settled back into his chair with the relaxed posture of a man who has assessed his surroundings and found nothing to concern him. I looked at Oliver, who was standing near the projection panel along the side wall. He gave me a single nod. I looked at Nathan, who was watching me from across the room, with the expression of a man who is ready. I set my champagne glass on the nearest table. I picked up the microphone. I did not give a speech. I showed them a building. "Before we go any further this evening," I said, my voice carrying to the back of the room without effort, "I want to share something with the people who matter most to us." The projection screen at the far end of the room came to life. The first thing they saw was the hallway of the Ritz-Carlton on the morning of June 14th, Vivienne entering the bridal suite at 5:47. Nathan in the corridor, arms crossed, not knowing. Vivienne at the luggage bench with the scissors. Her voice pulled from the ambient audio, filling the room with perfect clarity. "He thinks today is still his day. Let's see how proud he looks in front of 300 people when that shoulder lets go." The room went the way rooms go when something impossible has just been confirmed. The screen changed. Restaurant footage, time-stamped, February 14th. Vivienne and Damien Cross at a corner table leaning toward each other with the ease of people who have been meeting this way for a long time. Then text messages projected line by line, standard SMS exchanges between Vivienne and Damien that Nathan had quietly screenshotted during the 4 weeks he kept her talking, forwarded to Oliver, and confirmed authentic coordinates on Nathan's financial accounts, timelines for the asset transfer. And one message Oliver had told me was the clearest single piece of documentation in the entire file. Damien to Vivienne 11 months before the wedding, sent in a moment of carelessness on an unencrypted line. "Once you have control, Nathan stops mattering." I heard Evelyn pull in a breath beside me. Vivienne rose from her chair. Her face had gone through every arrangement it knew and found none of them adequate. "You did this," she said, pointing at me, her voice climbing. "You manufactured all of it. This is harassment. This is—" Nathan, my son, stood up from his seat across the room. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small digital recorder, the kind Oliver had recommended for its admissibility under Illinois law, and he set it on the table in front of him. "I recorded our conversations," he said. "Every one of them, for the past 4 weeks. He looked at Vivienne steadily without anger, with something quieter and more permanent than anger. "You told me the LLC was a legitimate investment vehicle. You told me the transfers were standard procedure. You told me my father had manipulated the evidence from the beginning." He paused. "I have all of it." Damien Cross stood. Oliver stepped forward from the side wall. Beside him stood a woman I had not introduced to anyone, a civil litigation attorney named Hargrove, who specialized in financial fraud and had been reviewing our evidentiary file for 2 weeks. She had a business card in her hand, and the particular composure of someone who has done this enough times to know exactly how it ends. "Mr. Cross," Oliver said, "I'd strongly recommend you stay." Damien looked at the recorder on the table. He looked at Hargrove. He looked at Vivian, who was no longer looking at him. He sat back down. The room held its silence for a long moment. Then Evelyn, who had not spoken since we arrived, turned in her chair and looked at Vivian with the same expression she had used in the ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton 10 weeks earlier. Not fury, not triumph. Something older and quieter than either. "I ironed that vest myself," she said. "I want you to remember that I said that to you twice. People ask me whether I feel guilty. I tell them the same thing I used to tell young contractors who felt bad about demolishing a structure that couldn't be saved. You don't grieve the building. You grieve what it could have been. And then you clear the site, and you decide what to build next, and you do not let the rubble dictate the blueprint." The weeks that followed the River North gathering moved on their own momentum, the way consequences always do once the load-bearing element has been removed, and the structure begins to find its natural resting position. Hargrove filed a civil complaint on Nathan's behalf within 10 days. Fraud, intentional misrepresentation, unjust enrichment. The LLC that Vivian had used to receive Nathan's transfers was identified in the filing as a vehicle for financial deception, and Nathan's attorney, a sharp, precise woman named Hargrove whom Oliver had recommended, and who billed in 6-minute increments and charged accordingly, moved immediately to have the Cook County Court invalidate the documents Nathan had signed without full disclosure. Under Illinois law, a contract obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation is voidable at the injured party's election. Hargrove elected. The court agreed within 3 weeks. The federal component was slower, as federal matters always are. The United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois opened a preliminary inquiry into the wire fraud allegations, 14 electronic transfers, each constituting a potential separate count under Title 18. And Oliver told me with the measured optimism of a man who has dealt with federal timelines for 3 decades that these things take the time they take, and that the evidence was solid, and that solid evidence has a way of arriving at the right conclusion eventually. I believed him. I have always believed him on the things that matter. Damien Cross retained a criminal defense attorney within 48 hours of the River North gathering and declined all further contact. His Series 65 license was flagged for review by FINRA. The shared office address in the loop went dark. I did not track what happened to him after that. It was not mine to track. Vivienne left Chicago. I know this because Nathan told me 6 weeks after the gathering in the same matter-of-fact tone he uses when he is delivering information he has already processed and does not need to discuss at length. She had moved to Phoenix, he said. He did not know the address. He did not need to. Nathan himself took longer. He went back to work within 2 weeks, which was characteristic. Nathan has always processed difficulty through structure and forward motion the same way I do, which is perhaps the most honest evidence I have that he is my son. But there were months when the calls came less frequently again, not because of distance this time, but because of the particular exhaustion of a person rebuilding their internal architecture after something has been deliberately destabilized. I did not push. I sent the texts. I showed up when he said come. I left when he needed me to. In October, he called on a Sunday evening, the old time, the old habit, as though it had never gone away. I've been thinking about what you said, he told me. In Oliver's office. About trusting the person she showed me. What about it? I asked. "I've been carrying it wrong," he said. "I kept thinking it meant I wasn't responsible for what happened. But that's not what you meant, was it?" I thought about it for a moment. "I meant that the failure of what she built is on her," I said. "What you do with the site after is on you. Those are different things." He was quiet for a few seconds. Then, "Yeah, that's what I thought you meant." He came for dinner 2 weeks later. Evelyn made pot roast, the Sunday recipe, the one with the carrots and the low oven and the 4 hours that cannot be rushed. And the three of us sat at the kitchen table where we had sat 10,000 times before, and we ate and we talked about his work and about a trip Evelyn and I were considering and about the back fence that needed replacing before winter. We did not talk about Vivian or Damien or River North or the Ritz-Carlton. We talked about the fence. Afterward, Nathan helped me carry the dishes to the sink, the way he had done since he was tall enough to reach it. And when the kitchen was clean, he stood in the back doorway for a moment, looking out at the yard in the October dark, and he said, without turning around, "I'm okay, Dad. I want you to know that." "I know," I said. "I mean actually okay," he said. "Not just saying it." "I know that too," I said. He turned around and looked at me the way he used to look at me across the tailgate of the pickup truck, when he was 9 years old and had understood something that had not made sense to him a moment before, with the particular expression of a person who has finished a calculation and found that the number, while not the one they wanted, is one they can work with. Then he put on his jacket and drove home. Evelyn and I stood on the front porch and watched his taillights until they turned the corner, and then we stood there a little longer because the October air was cool and still and the neighborhood was quiet and there was nowhere we needed to be. "He's going to be all right," she said. "Yes," I said. She took my hand the way she has taken it for 42 years, without ceremony, without announcement, simply because it was there, and she wanted to, and we stood on the porch of the house we had built our life inside of, and I thought about everything I had constructed over 4 decades, and everything that had been worth the building. And I thought the most important structure I ever put up was never a building. It was this. It was always this. I am not a man who tells stories for sympathy. I tell this one because I believe God puts certain moments in a man's life not to break him, but to show him exactly what he was built to protect. Family justice does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives on a Sunday evening when your son calls at the old time and says he is actually okay. If there is anything I want you to take from Dad's revenge stories like mine, do not wait until the foundation is already failing. Pay attention earlier than I did. Ask the questions I was too careful to ask. These are the lessons that Dad's revenge stories rarely spell out, but always carry underneath. My personal belief is simple. A man's greatest work is never a building. It is what he holds together for the people who need him most. Family justice is not revenge. It is refusing to let the wrong person win. This is the Dad's revenge stories that matters not because it ends perfectly, but because it ends honestly. And family justice looks like your wife's hand in yours on a front porch in October. If this stayed with you, comment below, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to this channel for more. Thank you for staying until the end. These stories contain fictional elements built for educational purposes. If this content is not for you, we respect that, and we hope you find something that is.